disenfranchisement's not the word, but like to argue against enfranchisement so openly, I think wouldn't have been possible, 40, 50 years ago. To argue in such an open way, no, these people shouldn't be allowed to vote.
So, do you mean specifically, like a few years ago you just mentioned there, what do you mean? Do you mean that you'd be less likely to make that kind of disenfranchisement argument in the past, or you'd be more likely?
I think in general society's moved a lot to the right since Thatcher, in general.
Okay.
So, like, in general, like, these kind of arguments against enfranchisement of certain groups are so openly done in a way that wouldn't have been possible. Like, I think people would have been more conciliatory before. Oh, we're not sure. I don't know. That's just my feeling about it. I think the lurch to the right makes these kind of arguments
more respectable in the public domain than they perhaps would have been in the past.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms myself, to be honest. But it's certainly one thing that confuses me, and you get this occasionally, is from some of the Dems, I think, in particular. I believe in enfranchising 16-year-olds, except for the referendum. I believe in every other circumstance but the practical ones in which we are. I think that's really lacks credibility. And I saw even, a couple of weeks ago, Margaret Curran, the Labour MP now, was on Question Time doing a rather elegant U-turn and endorsing the idea of 16-year-olds voting herself, which was a bit new. But I don't understand that. I don't understand this idea that I accept the general principle, but we have to universalize it to all elections for it to be a good idea. I think that's just folly, frankly.
Why?
Well, I think when you make the gains that you can make, and you say, well, that actually we'll get on to Hollywood elections, we'll get on to Westminster elections and European elections even in the future. It's this kind of idea that everything in our public sphere has to be neat, orderly, logical, and absolutely in alignment is loopy. Not least because our ideas about age limits are all over the place, about when you can have sex, when you can drink, when you can join the army, when you can change your name in England. But all of these things lack any sort of rational coherence. So I don't see why there's something fundamentally wrong about a slightly unusual extension of the franchise for a single election to referendum to 16 and 17-year-olds.
Yeah. Again, just the thing with the philosophical point, think about how we look at the guys who were standing up arguing against votes for women 100 years ago, and how out of time and how dated and horrible that sounds now. Are we going to be thinking that in 50 years' time about those arguing against this kind of enfranchisement? No, well, personally, I hope so.
I think you're right. And also, it maybe touches on another question, which is fundamentally, when do we think sort of responsible adulthood sort of begins? And actually, that changes over time. The sort of emergence of a particular idea of when adulthood starts, the emergence of an idea of teenagers, for example. The idea of teenagers is historically contingent. And it shouldn't surprise us that these shifts in the kind of dominant way of thinking and imagining people in our country shouldn't have an impact on how we go about voting, who the franchise is extended to. I think it makes sense to me. And it also explains perhaps why I can't really understand the problem people have with extending votes to 16-year-olds any more than I can really understand why people think that those in jail for 3 months for a breach of the peace, say, shouldn't get the vote either. I don't understand either proposition really. And I think that probably speaks to my relative youth and the kind of dominant ideas of the time in which I've been brought up, really.
Okay. All right. I tend to agree. Sorry. Okay. So, right, we'll go on to the third story of the week.
Which is your one, I think. This is something that you particularly were catching up on in the pages of the Scotsman and Herald newspapers about funding for the political campaigns around the independence referendum. Yeah,
because it's such a murky issue. Like, there are certain laws about spending limits, but first thing is there's been a kind of about face with. First, it was because the SNP, I think a while ago, got like a big, like some guy won the Euro Millions lottery. He gave the SNP £1 million, or the Yes campaign.
That's right, yeah.
So like the SNP are going to run away with this because they've got so much money. But now the story has completely because they want to put in some spending restrictions. I find it's such a murky issue because what's official spending and what's unofficial spending, and people doing things on their own, but are they nudged or are they encouraged to do it by official campaigns, yes or no, independents or unionists. The whole picture, whether it's Britain or America, about campaign funding is so unclear that you can spin it any way you like. And these stories, like one of the ideas I had for this little podcast that we're going to do was absurd scare story of the week. I quite like that idea because there's never any shortage. And I don't know if this is so much a scare story, but it's certainly one that, let's just say, they're not being honest.
No, I think I think that there is something in that. I mean, my understanding is that it's actually the SNP who are wanting to impose campaign spending limits because they are worried.
But the story a year ago was that they were against it, and that was terrible. And now they're for it, and that's terrible.
Yeah, because they wanted to spend their Edwin Morgan million and their, as you say, I think it was Euromillions million to stitch up the campaign and shaft the diligent and doughty folks of the Better Together campaign. But actually, my understanding is that now that the concern is that money would flood into Scotland from, particularly, from England, which obviously has a much higher population and much deeper pockets, from the Conservative Party, from the Labour Party, if it can overcome its current almost bankruptcy, I think. But there is a concern that the kind of voices and the finances of nationalism in a small part of the UK are much weaker potentially than the kind of money that can be commanded by the Conservative and Tory parties combined. The interesting thing from my point of view is that if you look at the Edinburgh Agreement per last Monday, that the power to decide what spending limits will be imposed in this referendum campaign have been given over entirely to the Scottish National Party in Holyrood. They will be able to set what the maximum spending is. They will be able to determine what the period is. I think you were perhaps describing that a wee bit there about when the kind of long campaign, the short campaign starts, and different limits applying in different periods of time, which has to be a real victory for the SNP here. I mean, because if they are the ones that want to impose these limits, then actually that's a really good thing from their point of view, that they're in a position politically and legally to do so. But as you say, the story's shifted a lot, and it's moved from this idea of a wealthy nationalism who will stitch it up, will rig the referendum, which I think is the phrase used in the papers recently, to something quite different from that. Quite different.
Now they're rigging it in the opposite way.
Precisely, yeah.
The same words used.
Yeah.
So, as ever, and I'm a bit of a snob, I hate to use an Americanism, but the wild card in all of this is social media. Because we were speaking a bit off air. Oh, there's a bit of green room chat there. But we were speaking a bit before we started recording about, like you were saying, you can put a video on YouTube and it goes viral. And it's kind of hard to trace who did that and where the money came from and stuff. So the social media is also a wild card in who's spending money where. It's very hard to have any kind of honesty in campaign finance discussions anymore, I think.
I think that's. I imagine actually the official campaigns, so say the Better Together and Yes Scotland, would be quite easily kind of policed. But as in funding of these questions, as with everything else, that actually the internet makes it much more difficult. So say I was much wealthier than I am and had a few hundred quid, a few thousand quid even, to bung into producing videos which made particular, hopefully persuasive arguments why Scots might want to vote independence, and use those resources to campaign during the kind of long or short campaigns around the referendum. As you say, it'd be really tricky to catch up with and to follow the money and see who's spending what. So I think that's a challenge as well. But I suspect, I mean, they're usually I think he said innocently abided by the big campaigns, and obviously that's where much of the money in terms of campaigning, in terms of printed material, will be filtered through. But there is, as you say, this kind of Wild West still online, of people also on a shoestring or with a wee bit more cash who are able to make significant interventions into the campaign, which can be really unexpected. And I think we've not really seen that yet, because the independence referendum still feels quite a long way off. But it's starting to increase,
Yeah, it's gearing up now a bit more.
Yeah.
Just as a last thing, I thought last week, with the signing of the Edinburgh Agreement, that was quite bizarre. Like, okay, now it's official. Now we're getting started. That was really just a photo op more than anything else. I think, they were always going to agree it. I don't know what exactly to say with that. Like, Salmon got his photo op with I noticed he had certain posters behind him, and the camera was conveniently placed a couple of times. But I don't know. Do you think too much was made of it, the signing of the Edinburgh Agreement, or do you think it was an important moment, or is it just a photo op ceremony?
Yeah, both are true, I think. But I think it was perhaps more important than some people might think, and I see this as a constitutional anorak, because the whole issue about the legality of the referendum, whatever Ian Davidson might say, and frankly whatever many nationalists say, was really up in the air. Without cutting a deal on an order in council under the Scotland Act to make absolutely clear that Holyrood had the power, this was going to end up in the biggest bonanza, poisonous constitutional case you could ever imagine. And that's been foreclosed now. And a few constitutional lawyers may be sad about that might not happen, but it's a really, really good thing both for nationalists and for unionists, if not, as I said elsewhere, for those that believed in a second question on devolution. The second thing is, and I've made this point elsewhere too, that it was a really good moment, semiotically, if you like, in terms of just the image projected by Alex Salmond, that he managed to get David Cameron to come to Edinburgh. He managed to meet him as if he was a foreign head of state on the steps of St Andrew's House in Edinburgh, and we had that kind of co-signatory moment with the map of the SNP victory behind them. Now that's a wee thing. It's just, as you say, a photo op, and one can overstate how important they are. But all of these small opportunities to project an idea of Scotland as an independent state, engaged in signing treaties, dealing with international leaders, it gave us a very concrete image of what the diplomatic activity of an independent Scotland with England after independence might look like. And, as the old cliche has it, an image is 1,000 words in terms of its significance. And I think that's why it was a cunning bit of strategy by Salmond and important in its small way towards fostering these images which are important for Scottish nationalism.
Okay. And I think that's enough for the first episode of For All That, and hopefully I'll speak to you next week.
Indeed, and hopefully interesting things will happen to divert us and keep our audience cheery with any luck.
In fact, if our audience have any particular things they wish discussed, they can get in touch. My email is on the podcast page, so you can get it there. Okay?
Cheerio!
Bye-bye.
Forward! March! Gather together, be brothers and sisters, learn the